craning my neck back and forth like this if I don't stand up and look you in the eye and talk to these slides. It's probably important for me to say that although I'm an official with the Global Environment Facility, I'm wearing my American citizen hat today. I think it's important to draw that distinction. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Global Environment Facility. Ambassador Rooney and his team invited me, and I'm being supported by U.S. Embassy funds today, and I want to acknowledge that out of appreciation. But if you've worn as many hats as I have over the years, you need to be careful about what hat you're wearing in any given meeting. And today, I'm really speaking as an American, someone who's been around this process for a long time. I was kind of assigned this title, The Road to Copenhagen, and it's been a long and dusty road. For me, that road began about 21 years ago. I've been in and around this work since 1988. I was the simple guy in the back of the room that held up his hand when they said, anybody want to work on global climate change in 1988? And indeed, it's been an interesting journey. I never thought it would become my life's work, but it has. And in some ways, it's been very rewarding work, but it's also work that's required a lot of patience. So when I think about the road to Copenhagen, though, I think back and reflect on the prior 14 conferences of the parties, all the INC meetings, all the intergovernmental meetings, and it's been a tumultuous set of discussions and negotiations, and some disappointments, some low points and high points. And today I thought that I would speak to 4 or 5 issues which I think are defining the discussions and the road to Copenhagen. We have 15, count them, 15 negotiating days left before we get to Copenhagen. The interested parties and stakeholders will meet in Bangkok beginning on Monday for 10 working days. And then we'll meet again in Barcelona in Spain in early November. And so we have 15 negotiating days left. And as Ivo de Boer was quoted, everybody know who Ivo is? Ivo de Boer, head of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, said that this is a quote, the climate change negotiations are a mess, and that the 250 dog-eared pages of text are so poorly written and disorganized that it's impossible for my staff to translate them into other UN languages. So with Ivo kind of setting the stage like that, it's not all that encouraging. I don't think it's quite that dismal, but I'm sure from where he sits, it's a very unmanageable, unwieldy, unpredictable process. I'm sure Ivo de Boer and others were hoping to get some wind at their back from the statements, the leader statements coming out of the United Nations General Assembly meetings the last couple of days. I'm not sure if he got that wind that he wanted. A number of leaders did speak to the climate change issue, and some of you probably have pored over those speeches. I didn't see a lot new, but I'm going to explain to you why I don't think we saw or heard anything new the last couple of days. I'm going to reflect on that. Certainly from an American perspective, I think the Americans view this as a negotiation. And if you don't show all the cards in your hand 3 months before you get to the table in Copenhagen, and I think the Chinese and Indians and others are doing the same thing. So I didn't have particularly high hopes for the UN General Assembly meetings on climate change the last couple of days, and I don't have very high hopes for the Bangkok meetings. But I think as we get closer to Copenhagen, you'll see more and more interesting proposals at the table. But I thought I'd walk through a little bit of data which tease up some of the big issues. And to me, there are 4 or 5 big issues. There are literally hundreds of issues and sub-issues, but 4 or 5 big ones that are on my mind from my perspective, serving at the White House and U.S. Department of Energy and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. One top issue, of course, is the level of ambition. Just how deep should emission cuts be for both developed and developing countries? And of course, that's a huge debate, very different perspectives on who should go first, how deep should the cuts be, how do we arrive at these emission reductions, and how do we fulfill promises? And I'm going to speak to some of the data that surround those discussions in a few minutes. Secondly, of course, is who pays, the finance. And the IIEA estimates that this is at least a $1 trillion, maybe a $2 trillion decision vis-a-vis who pays for the investments in alternative technologies and policies and practices. And of course, there are very different perspectives on who pays. Is it the developing countries, the developed countries, or is it some combination thereof? A third issue, of course, revolves around technology. I mean, can we fix the climate system? I mean, do we have the tools at hand to actually fix it? The size of the problem is enormous, unprecedented in terms of its scale and such. You all know that. But I'm going to speak to some of the technologies. There are other issues. Adaptation to climate change. The last 21 years, we've not made very much progress on negotiations vis-a-vis mitigation. Should we think more and more about adaptation? So big issues on the radar screen. There are others that I'm going to leave them out. Certainly a lot of interest in forests and such, but I'm going to speak to those 2 or 3 or 4 top issues in these slides in the next few minutes. First and foremost, I just want to reflect on, and this is all IEA data, okay? This isn't American data, this isn't Irish data, this is IEA data, which I think is generally pretty well scrubbed. But you can decide whether you like it or don't like it. But one thing I've learned in chasing data in my 30 years in this business is that you chase data long enough, hard enough, you'll always chase it back to Paris on most energy data, because in fact, one way or another, that data resides in Paris at the IEA. But these are trends in total CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion in the early part of this century, 2000, 2005. It's not the most recent data, but it's the most recent data that's actually been validated, verified independently vis-a-vis all the different checks and balances that the IEA uses. And I just want to, again, wearing my American hat here, try to describe how we see ourselves vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And these are changes in GDP, and least improved and most improved vis-a-vis their CO2 emissions. At least from an American perspective, we don't think we're doing all that bad. Of course, we get terribly beat up because our total emissions, of course, are second largest in the world after China and such. But if you break it down on recent trends and changes in the economy, and as America moves away from a manufacturing and industrial economy to more oriented to a service economy, we have seen some changes in our emissions profile. If we look at improvements in CO2 emissions based on real GDP intensity, again, same data points. Again, America's not doing too awfully bad. Again, I know we get beat up by different negotiating teams vis-a-vis, well, your emissions on a per capita basis are pretty bad, and the average Indian uses much less energy than the average American. And certainly all that is true. But when you try to quantify it in terms of gross domestic product, our industrial output, and the goods and services that we produce around the world, that's what the data looks like. And of course, we compare ourselves to the Chinese, which are now the largest emitter in the world. And we have our own views vis-a-vis as where America sits in the pecking order in terms of improvements and what needs to be done and what has been done. So again, just a little bit of data to reflect on. I'm told not to press the middle. If I press this, there we go. This is where I want to drill down on the data. These are transitions in emitting countries over the coming decades. This is in terms of CO2 emissions, and the purple are the OECD countries, or the developed countries. And of course, the developing countries are the non-OECD countries. And this is where I think the negotiations get really interesting, and this is why we see, I think, huge differences of opinion vis-a-vis levels of ambition, who pays, who invests in technology, and so on and so forth. Because if you look at the purple, the trend lines down here, and going forward over out to 2050, emissions from the developed countries are pretty steady. In fact, on a global basis, they actually decrease. But if you look at the emissions, of course, in the developing countries, they grow dramatically. And of course, these are all based upon scenarios. No one knows for sure whether these emissions will continue to grow at this rate. But based upon current economic trends, with China's economy expanding at 10% a year, India's economy expanding at 8 or 9% a year, Brazil doing a little bit less than that. This is what could happen. So indeed, for the developed countries, the U.S. in particular, to buy in to a treaty or an agreement or group of agreements which begins to codify these emission profiles, well, it doesn't seem to be a very wise thing to do. Obviously, we did not support the Kyoto Protocol because the Kyoto Protocol, of course, left a lot of emissions outside of the agreement. And I think the lesson learned from that experience, at least again from an American perspective, is that we need to not only look at what the historic trends have been, and certainly the OECD countries have been much larger emitters than developing countries, but if we go fast forward out to the middle of the century, and some people in this room will live to the middle of the century, hopefully most of us will, this is what the picture could look like. And so it creates a very interesting set of negotiating dynamics for those in developed and developing countries. And I think the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, Indonesians, and others who are at the top of that list that are composed most of these emissions are very cognizant of this data. And frankly, although 5-10 years ago they argued with this kind of analysis, now you see these kinds of analysis being published in the open literature in China and India and other places. And at one time I think there was some resistance to accepting these trends and scenarios, but they've done them themselves and so on and so forth, and I think they began to buy into the concept that yes, they will have ownership of substantial emissions in the future, and their emissions will perhaps be larger than some of the historic emissions of the OECD countries. So some interesting numbers to think about if you're a negotiator and trying to come to an agreement over a treaty which will govern these emission profiles for decades and decades into the future. If we look at global CO2 emissions, and this is a 2000 and 2050 reference case, and 2050 at 50% with 50% reductions, and we chose 50% reductions because that's what the Prime Minister of Japan and the UK and other countries have proposed as being reasonable targets for the OECD countries. So here we are today at about 26 gigatons per year. Those are 2,000 emissions. And this is the reference case. This is what it'll grow to in the middle of the century. Again, these are scenarios. These are not perfect numbers. You bet that it won't be exactly 50.6 gigatons at the middle of the century, but these are reasonable predictions based upon current industrial trends, current emission trends, current GDP and such. And then this is what's required to bring emissions down at 50% of the 2000 emissions. And it's very difficult to imagine implementing this level of ambition using today's technologies. And so that's why the technology picture becomes so important in these discussions, because in fact we're all looking at radically different lifestyles. Certainly those of us who live in OECD countries, life as we know it will be very, very different in the future if we buy into those levels of ambitions without new technologies. Now this slide gets a little bit more complicated, but hopefully you can stay with the trends here. These are CO2 emission reductions needed to achieve a 50% global emission reduction below 2000 by 2050 under 3 different reduction goals for OECD countries. So here we are, 2050 projections again, 50 gigatons. This is the reference case. If OECD countries, Ireland, US, all of us, we go to 0, and we have no emissions, of course, which is impossible. But nonetheless, the non-OECD countries still have to bring down their emissions by at least 60% to help us get to the goals, the levels of ambition that we want. The OECD emissions at 20% reductions, again, similar story, draconian cuts for the OECD countries. But the point is that in fact developing countries in all of these scenarios are going to have to take on some level of ambition. I mean, even in a perfect world where we all become Luddites, I guess, if you will, and we completely abandon the lifestyles that we have, it's impossible to achieve the emission reductions unless developing countries take on very big levels of ambitions relative to their ambitions today and to get with the program. So these are very difficult numbers to cope with because under the current, of course, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, developing countries have no commitments. The OECD countries have some commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. We tried, assigning commitments to different parties and such. Some achieved it, some didn't. The point is, as you look out to the middle of the century, we're all going to have to, indeed, be involved in emission reduction activities. It's impossible for OECD countries to do all the heavy lifting. Now, this is a slide that actually showed up on page 10 of the Financial Times today. So it's in your local newspaper today. But I just wanted to remind everybody kind of the size of the problem, because this helps frame the discussions on level of ambition, on finance, and on technology. You think, well, we can go out and do this. I mean, with renewables and energy efficiency, we can get this done. But again, 50% reductions, we're aiming at a 50 gigaton emission reduction. Well, how big is a gigaton? What's it take to get it done? Well, we need to build 273 zero-emission 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants just to achieve 1 gigaton reduction. And by the way, how many of these do we have in the world today? 0. Yeah, we have none. Okay? So it just gives you the idea of the kind of infrastructure changes that are needed on a global scale to get to 1 gigaton. Remember, we need 50. Okay? All right. You don't like coal. I'm not a big coal guy. So I like other technologies. So I'm going to kind of go down this list. But if you're still in love with coal and you think you can sequester it, then, well, it's a good technology. It probably works in some parts of the world. We're getting to understand a lot more about it. And we have a few long-term experiments like the Sleipner project, injecting CO2 off the coast of Norway. But we're going to need 1,000 of those. Not just one, we need 1,000 of those to get to 1 gigaton. Okay, let's say you don't like coal, you like nuclear. You need to build 136 new nuclear plants at 1 gigawatt capacity each for a gigaton. Now, we've never had a nuclear energy program on this planet that has built out nuclear power plants at that rate. Back in the 1960s and 70s, when France and Japan and the US other countries were building nuclear plants, we built 10, 20 a year at max. And just to get to 1 gigaton, we need to build out 136 new ones. Okay, so you don't like coal, you don't like nuclear. Down the list, we can get it all done through efficiency. We need to employ 273 million new cars to get 40 miles per gallon. Maybe that's achievable with electric cars, I'm not sure, or with hydrogen or other technologies. But the point is the numbers are big. If you like wind, you need to install 270,000 1 megawatt turbines to get to a gigaton. So you get my drift here. The size of this challenge is huge. And therefore, I don't think the IEA or other estimates, Lord Stern, whoever's book you want to read, we're talking between a $1 and $2 trillion shift in our economies to get this done. It's a big investment, and these are big technologies. They're going to be done on a scale that we've never achieved before in our history as citizens of this planet. So I just want to leave that with you, let you kind of digest that, because as we talk about finance and technology and level of ambition, I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, those that are governing are those in the private sector that actually build and operate these facilities. It's an enormous challenge. And sometimes I think this gets overlooked in the negotiations. And as we think about the negotiating text and the road to Copenhagen and such, I'm just not sure whether all the negotiators keep the size and the scale of the problem in mind as they're at the table, because indeed these are huge challenges. And there's lots of alternatives which are not on this slide. This is just meant to illustrate the size of the challenge. This doesn't speak to some pretty organic issues either. I mean, if you like nuclear, what do you do with all the waste? Very difficult thing to do. If you like fossil energy, we pretty much know that we have finite fossil energy reserves on this planet. Projections vary. China and the US probably at current use rates have enough coal to support their economies for 200 or 300 more years. But the point is that there are a lot of questions regarding sustainable development that surround all these technologies. So it's not just as easy as thinking about finance or technology or just the logistics of getting this done. Here's my last anecdote. I often speak to groups like this, and I was asked to go to Canada last year and to speak to the Canadian Nuclear Energy Association. Canada has a sizable, respectable nuclear energy program, and it was a big meeting. There were 1,000 people in the room, and I was giving a speech a little bit like this, and kind of scanning across the room, looking at all the smiling faces, and I noticed that everybody in the room was about 60 years plus. And it reminds me that everybody in the room, even though I don't have much hair in my head, they had less hair, and the hair that they had was all gray. And it reminded me that even if we wanted to get to this level of ambition for nuclear energy, that we probably don't even have the human capital. That is, we've not invested in the generations of nuclear energy engineers to even begin to think about planning, building, or operating nuclear energy plants. And I think that's probably also true. I know it's true in wind energy and solar energy and other technologies, that we just don't have the armies. Literally, we're going to need armies of the technologists to get this work done. We've just not invested as societies in training the cadre of people at a global scale that it'll take to implement these plans. I'd like to just wrap up by speaking a little bit to the major economies process. You think, well, God, what's this guy talking about, the major economies process? Why is that important? Well, this is why I think it's important. This is why I think it's going to influence the outcomes at Copenhagen and beyond. This is a process that was started under the German leadership of the G8 3 years ago. And it's a regular meeting of the 18 largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. And it's a rotating chairmanship. And the U.S. lent quite a bit of support to it. It was my job at the White House a couple of years to stand this up and make it run. This was a paper that I'd written for President Bush, I think 6 years ago. And they pulled it out the last couple of years of the administration, decided to see if they could work with the Germans and others in the G8 to stand it up, and they did. But it's a process that's led by leaders, and that's why I think it's significant. It's really the only regular meeting of leaders in which they speak to the climate change issue. Indeed, leaders, some very important leaders, spoke at the United Nations under the leadership of Ban Ki-moon a couple of days ago on the climate change talks, but that happens once a year. And each leader has, 5 or 10 minutes to speak. So it's really not a dialogue, it's not a discussion, it doesn't really contribute to the negotiating process, at least in my humble opinion. The major economies process is built such that ministers get together on a regular basis, leaders get together on a regular basis to discuss different opportunities and challenges in the climate change arena. So that's why I think it's a potential contributor to the outcomes in Copenhagen. And not surprisingly, the topics that they discuss at major economies meetings are the same topics that are discussed, of course, in the broad discussions of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, why do I think this is particularly important for Copenhagen? There's a couple anecdotes I'll share with you. I'm unsure of the outcomes at Copenhagen. I'm hopeful, but I'm also a little bit skeptical that we'll see much happen there. But I do have my eye on the Obama-Hu summit, President Hu of China, President Obama in the U.S. They'll meet in Beijing in November. And I think they're both preparing major announcements on the climate change issue. And certainly those two countries, which are responsible for about 40% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, not quite 40%. If they get out in front on this issue and lead, I think that will help lend momentum to the process in Copenhagen. And if they can come to an agreement on a bilateral approach, which would lend itself to a multilateral approach, then I think that will lend momentum to the discussions. And certainly this close dialogue between the United States and China really unfolded as part of the major economies process. Another anecdote that I'll share with you is one down here. Adaptation. For many years, as you all know, that adaptation was the weak sister at the negotiations. Adaptation didn't get a lot of attention. certainly didn't get much financial support. In some delegations, including the American delegation, we really didn't want to talk about adaptation. The theory was the following. If you talked about adaptation, if you negotiated adaptation agreements and such, that means that you actually give up on that implies that you actually give up on your mitigation options. But I think that thinking is changing, that we need to discuss not only options to mitigate over multiple decades into the future, but we need to adapt to a changing climate which is occurring today. And I think you'll see adaptation move up the ladder. I think it has moved up the ladder in the negotiations. And I think there will be a lot more investment in adaptation. There has been more investment in adaptation in the last several years, and I think you'll see more and more in the future. So those are just two anecdotes related to the major economies process, which I think will lend some momentum to the discussions, the formal discussions at the United Nations at Copenhagen. I'll conclude by saying that I will not be disappointed if we don't see a grand agreement in Copenhagen. I mean, I take the long view. After being in this business for 21 years, if it takes you 2 or 3 more years to get this right, I think we ought to invest the time in to do that. I feel sorry for the Danes. I know they want a grand agreement in Denmark. They put, I think, 100 million euros into this particular COP, which blows my mind. I think about how many tons of greenhouse gases that money could mitigate instead of setting up a climate change meeting for 10 or 15,000 delegates in Copenhagen. But nonetheless, we hope it's a good meeting. We hope the outcomes are strong. But that 250 pages of tired negotiating text, which Ivo de Boer describes as a mess, we have a long way to go and only 15 negotiating days to get it done. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn it back to you. Hopefully I've shown enough data that will evoke some thoughts and discussion. But again, I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to at least share some perspectives wearing my American hat for a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.